A single sip, and death followed. Welcome to Midnight Confessions. I am your host, Danny. This community is incredible. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Your voices make these mysteries come alive. Let's begin. The village of Little Hawthorne had a way of pretending that time never truly passed. Its cobbled lanes, ivy-laced cottages, and the faint scent of roses in the air seemed preserved from an earlier century. Yet beneath this charming veneer lay the same undercurrents of pride, envy, and quiet malice that Miss Marple often said were as natural to village life as tea at 4 o'clock. On this particular afternoon, Mrs. Penelope Hargreaves, widow of a respectable solicitor and reigning hostess of the village, was holding her annual summer garden party. The lawns of Hawthorne Grange shimmered in the gentle sun, tables dressed in white linen and adorned with hydrangeas. Villagers mingled politely, sipping tea and discussing the weather, the new vicar's sermon, and the ever-declining standards of the local youth. Miss Marple sat near the rose trellis, quietly knitting something in soft blue wool. Her eyes, mild and pale as forget-me-nots, moved from guest to guest with the faintest flicker of amusement. No one noticed her observing. Indeed, few ever did. The air hummed with the gentle clatter of china and laughter. Colonel Geoffrey Latham, recently retired from the army, held court near the tea table, boasting of his service in Burma. Beside him stood Dr. Henry Baines, the local physician, refilling his cup with a knowing smile. Vera Collins, Mrs. Hargreaves' companion, moved gracefully between guests, her polite conversation concealing something more brittle beneath. Then there was Mr. Owen Ridley, the village's newest resident, a London journalist said to be resting after some unpleasantness involving a libel suit. He had taken a cottage near the mill and was still regarded with cautious curiosity. His manner was affable, though his questions were too sharp for comfort. Mrs. Hargreaves, ever the attentive hostess, poured tea from a gleaming silver teapot with delicate ceremony. "One lump or two, Reverend?" she asked, smiling toward Reverend Miles, who looked mildly nervous in his clerical collar. The silver glinted. The teacups clinked. The bees droned lazily, and then, suddenly, a sharp, choking sound cut through the afternoon air. Every head turned. Mr. Ridley had dropped his teacup, the china shattering against the flagstones. His hands clawed at his throat. A terrible gurgle escaped his lips before he slumped sideways from his chair, face contorted, eyes glassy. For a moment, no one moved. Then came the shrieks. Mrs. Hargreaves dropped the teapot. Dr. Baines rushed forward, his voice calm but urgent. "Stand back, all of you," he barked, but even as he knelt beside the stricken man, the truth was evident in his expression. Owen Ridley was dead. The shock ripples through the village. The next morning, Little Hawthorne was alive with whispers. Mrs. Hargreaves' garden party had become the most scandalous event in village history. Murder, or at least something very like it, had intruded upon the sacred calm of their lives. Some said it was a heart attack. Others murmured darkly of poison. "There was something peculiar about that teapot," claimed Mrs. Finch, the grocer's wife. "Didn't look like her usual one, not with that dull spout." The police arrived from Market Chipping, led by Inspector Graves, a square-shouldered man with a tendency to underestimate elderly women. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he declared with brisk authority. He began by questioning Mrs. Hargreaves, who, though pale and trembling, insisted that the tea had been made as usual. Earl Grey, steeped precisely 3 minutes. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply sat in her small parlor later that evening, the ticking of the clock the only sound. Her knitting lay idle in her lap. She had noticed, of course, that Mrs. Hargreaves' companion, Miss Vera Collins, had been the one to refill the pot just before Mr. Ridley's final cup. She'd also noticed that Vera's hands had trembled ever so slightly when she did so, and, most interestingly, She recalled that Vera and Mr. Ridley had spoken in private a week earlier, by the gate near the post office, where voices had been raised just enough for anyone with sharp ears to hear the words, "You wouldn't dare." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. It was, she thought, a most improper thing to happen over tea. End of section 1. The garden party at Little Hawthorne. Next, the village reacts, where gossip turns to suspicion, and Miss Marple begins to listen more closely than anyone realizes. The following morning dawned grey and uncertain, as though the very skies over Little Hawthorne were reluctant to look down upon what had occurred. The mist that clung to the hedgerows gave the village a hushed, almost penitential air, and for once the bells of St. Mildred's seemed subdued. Yet within the village, tongues were anything but silent. By 8 o'clock, the gossip had already travelled from the butcher's to the post office, and by 10 it had reached the entire parish. Mrs. Finch, who prided herself on never repeating what she heard unless it was of public interest, had seen the constable's bicycle by Hawthorne Grange, and took it upon herself to inform anyone who came in for bacon that poison was involved, definitely poison, and quite possibly arsenic. Mr. Weatherby, the station master, declared that he had always thought that journalist fellow looked the sort to make enemies, and Mrs. Pollard of the mill added darkly that Mrs. Hargreaves's teapot had an odd history, having been a gift from her late husband's chambers in London, where goodness knows what sort of clients he had. Miss Marple heard most of this without comment as she shopped for sugar and lavender soap that morning. She had an unassuming manner of listening, eyes wide, lips faintly pursed, as though every opinion was both welcome and faintly surprising. The shopkeeper, accustomed to her gentleness, never suspected that she remembered every word, every inflection, and every inconsistency. By noon, Inspector Graves had already made his preliminary inquiries. He was a stout man with a booming voice, whose faith in straightforward procedure was unshakable. In his mind, crime was an untidy accident to be methodically cleaned up. He believed that by speaking firmly enough, the truth would reveal itself out of sheer respect. But in Little Hawthorne, truth was far too polite to shout. At the Grange, Mrs. Hargreaves sat pale and tremulous beside the parlour fire. The previous day's party dress had been replaced by a severe black frock, and her once tidy coiffure had begun to wilt. The teapot, offending object and all, had been removed, taken away in a carefully labelled evidence box. Inspector Graves questioned her with officious sympathy. "You prepared the tea yourself, madam?" "Vera did, Inspector. I was seeing to the sandwiches." Her fingers fidgeted against her lace handkerchief. "The blend came from my usual tin, I'm certain of it." "Miss Collins, your companion?" "Yes, Vera. Poor girl. She's been with me nearly 5 years. She isn't well since yesterday, quite distraught, as we all are." The inspector nodded, jotting notes with deliberate strokes. "And Mr. Ridley, did you know him well?" "Only through village gatherings. He was cordial, I suppose. A little inquisitive. My late husband would have called him a ferret with a notebook." Miss Marple, who had been sitting discreetly in a corner at Mrs. Hargreaves' request, for moral comfort, you know, Jane, lifted her gaze briefly from her knitting. "I always think, dear," she said softly, "that inquisitive men are often lonely ones. They ask questions because they lack something inside themselves. I wonder if Mr. Ridley might have been one of those?" Inspector Graves gave her a faintly patronizing smile. "A very philosophical view, Miss Marple. But this was no act of loneliness, I'm afraid. The post-mortem will tell us precisely what it was." That evening, Little Hawthorne held its collective breath as word came that the laboratory had found traces of digitalis, deadly in the wrong dose, within the remains of Mr. Ridley's tea. The village physician, Dr. Baines, confirmed that the substance was kept in his surgery for heart patients. Its presence in an ordinary cup of Earl Grey could not be accidental. Whispers grew louder, coiling like smoke. Miss Vera Collins became the most convenient topic of conversation. It was said that she had once been a nurse before taking service with Mrs. Hargreaves. It was also said, though no one could prove it, that she had known Mr. Ridley before he came to the village. By the time dusk fell, the story had twisted itself into a small tragedy of love, betrayed, and vengeance brewed in porcelain. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took her evening tea by the window of her neat little cottage on the high street. The roses along her fence glowed pale against the dimming sky. She had seen Miss Collins earlier that day, walking hurriedly toward the rectory with eyes red from weeping. Guilt, fear, or grief. It was often difficult to tell them apart until one looked closely enough. Her visitor arrived just as the clock struck 8. The Reverend Miles himself, anxious and flustered. "My dear Miss Marple," he began, "this dreadful affair has unsettled the entire parish. Mrs. Hargreaves is inconsolable, and Vera, well, she's taken refuge in the church. Says she has nowhere else to go. I fear the inspector may think that suspicious." Miss Marple poured him tea with her usual calm precision. "People often go to church when their consciences trouble them, Reverend," she said mildly. "Though sometimes it's their nerves, not their sins, that send them there." He looked startled, then smiled weakly. "You have such insight, Miss Marple. I wish the inspector were as understanding." "Oh, I'm sure he means well," she said. "But men who rely on order rarely see what hides behind it. I do wonder, though, did anyone remark upon the teapot itself?" He blinked. "The teapot. I believe the inspector has it. Why do you ask?" "It struck me as curious," Miss Marple murmured. The handle was polished bright as a mirror, but the spout was dull, almost tarnished. One wouldn't notice unless one were pouring. And Vera, you'll remember, was the last to pour. The Reverend shifted uneasily. "You think she meant harm?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "I think, dear Reverend, that one mustn't leap to conclusions. But it's ever so interesting, don't you agree, when things shine unevenly? In life, as in silverware, it often means one part has been touched rather more than another." When he had gone, she sat for a long while in thoughtful silence. The threads of the affair began to form a pattern in her mind, not yet complete, but unmistakably familiar. She had seen something like it once in St. Mary Mead long ago, when jealousy and respectability had collided most unpleasantly. Human nature, she reflected, had a dreadful habit of repeating itself. At Hawthorne Grange, meanwhile, Inspector Graves was making progress of his own. A search of Miss Collins' room had uncovered a small brown medicine bottle labeled Digitalis, Dr. H. Baines. It was nearly empty. By morning, the village awoke to the news that Miss Vera Collins had been arrested for the murder of Owen Ridley. The case, in the eyes of most, was neatly tied. But as Miss Marple read the headline in the market-chipping Gazette, she sighed softly and laid the paper aside. "Too tidy," she said aloud, to no one in particular. Far, far too tidy. Outside, the sun broke through the mist, and the church bells began to toll. Life in Little Hawthorne continued, outwardly serene, but Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully, her eyes bright and far away. She knew, as surely as she knew the pattern of her knitting, that the wrong person was sitting in a cell, and that somewhere in the village the true hand that had poured death into a teacup still smiled politely over breakfast. The morning following Miss Collins's arrest dawned unnaturally bright, as if the sunlight itself were trying too hard to scrub away the shadows of suspicion that had settled upon Little Hawthorne. In the narrow lanes, where geraniums leaned from cottage windows and the milkman's cart rattled softly by, people spoke in low tones, glancing over shoulders before uttering Vera's name. The village, once so content in its routine of teas and sermons, now breathed scandal with every word. Miss Marple, however, was not to be found at her usual place in the garden that morning. She had walked instead to Dr. Baines's surgery, a small whitewashed building near the edge of the green. Her gait was unhurried, her expression mild, yet her eyes were alert beneath the soft brim of her hat. She had known Henry Baines since his apprenticeship under old Dr. Lorimer, a kindly man, if rather too sure of his own professional rectitude. The doctor looked up from his ledger as she entered. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I must say, this business has everyone quite shaken. Poor Miss Collins, though I can't deny the evidence seems conclusive." Miss Marple seated herself primly, smoothing her gloves. "Evidence is a curious thing, Doctor. It has such a tendency to point in whichever direction one wishes it to. I came only to ask, how does one keep digitalis exactly? I mean for patients, of course." He blinked, surprised. "In locked storage, naturally. I prepare individual doses myself. It's potent stuff. Used properly, it strengthens the heart, but a little too much." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "Well, you've seen what happened." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "And you haven't noticed any bottles missing?" "None that I can recall," he said briskly, though a faint line creased his brow. The inspector asked the same thing. "Still, I don't think Vera Collins could have taken it. She'd have had to break into my cabinet, and I've seen no sign of tampering." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting bag resting lightly in her lap. "It's so odd, isn't it? A young woman of gentle manners, who nurses her employer with such care, suddenly committing murder at a public gathering. I can't help but think, if she'd truly intended such a thing, she would hardly have done it with so many eyes upon her." The doctor sighed. "You've a kind heart, Miss Marple, but sometimes good people do foolish things. Perhaps she lost her temper, or perhaps the man knew something that frightened her." That last remark seemed to catch her attention. Her gaze lingered thoughtfully on the neat rows of medicine bottles. "Yes," she murmured. "Frightened people do very strange things indeed." "Thank you, Doctor. You've been most helpful." She left the surgery with the same quiet step she'd entered, but her mind was working as steadily as the clockwork ticking of her parlor mantelpiece. She had begun to sense that the truth of the matter was not to be found in Vera Collins's nervous hands, but in the quieter corners of little Hawthorne's respectable society. By the time she reached the lane that led to the vicarage, she happened upon Colonel Latham, resplendent in a checked tweed suit and clutching a walking stick more ornamental than useful. "Ah, Miss Marple, terrible business, what? Never thought I'd see the day. Poison, of all things. Dashed un-English way to settle one's grievances." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "I quite agree, Colonel. You were sitting near Mr. Ridley, were you not?" "Close enough," he said, puffing his chest slightly. "Saw the whole ghastly thing. Fellow barely finished his cup before he keeled over. Never saw such a look on a man's face, like he'd just realized the devil was real after all." "And you didn't notice anyone behaving unusually?" she asked. "Unusually?" Good heavens, everyone was behaving unusually. Mrs. Pollard fainted, the vicar shouted for brandy, and Mrs. Hargreaves was flapping about like a hen with its feathers singed. He paused, lowering his voice. "If you ask me, the girl's guilty, but between ourselves, I never trusted that Ridley chap either. Bit too clever. Had a way of prying into one's affairs. Asked me questions about Burma, of all things. Things a stranger had no right to know." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And did you answer him?" The Colonel's eyes shifted. "Naturally not. Dashed impudent, if you ask me. Said he was researching some old case for a magazine. Hinted that someone in the village might have done something regrettable in the past. Nonsense, of course. Can't imagine who he meant." She smiled faintly. "Human nature does have a way of surprising us, Colonel. Thank you for the chat." As she walked on, the faintest furrow appeared between her brows. Ridley's line of questioning intrigued her. A man who made a living exposing secrets was bound to unearth some that others preferred buried. If he had been murdered, it might not have been for who he was, but for what he knew. That afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Hargreaves herself, pale and trembling, clutching her handbag as though it were a life-preserver. "Oh, Jane," she cried as soon as Miss Marple opened the door. "I cannot bear it, to think that this dreadful thing should have happened in my own garden, and to poor Vera. They say she may hang for it." Miss Marple led her gently to the fireside, pressing a cup of tea into her shaking hands. "Now, my dear, we mustn't assume the worst. The inspector has his duties, but the truth has a way of presenting itself when one keeps one's eyes open." Mrs. Hargreaves dabbed at her eyes. "But it's all so horrible. I can't think how it happened. Vera would never harm a soul. She's been loyal, devoted, and yet lately I fear she's been troubled, ever since that horrid Mr. Ridley started coming around." "Did he visit you often?" "Twice, perhaps 3 times. He said he was writing an article about the history of the Grange, but I know now he was after something else. He asked questions, so many questions, about my husband's legal work, about old clients, and then, oh, Jane, it's so shameful. I found him talking to Vera in the lane one evening. She looked terrified. I didn't ask why." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Fear is a powerful thing, Penelope. Sometimes it binds people tighter than affection." Mrs. Hargreaves looked bewildered. "Do you think she knew something then? Something about him?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that people rarely kill for strangers. They kill for secrets, and little Hawthorne, for all its roses, has quite a few of those." When Mrs. Hargreaves departed, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and despair, Miss Marple sat back in her chair and considered what she had learned. Ridley had been prying into old matters, legal affairs connected to Mrs. Hargreaves's late husband. Vera Collins, once a nurse, might have known something dangerous. The Colonel, too, had reacted curiously, more defensive than indignant. It was a tangle of motives, all rooted in reputation, fear, and the quiet desperation to keep the past unspoken. At twilight, she strolled once more to the churchyard, where she found the Reverend Miles closing the vestry door. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said softly, "you've heard. The inspector's satisfied now. Says the bottle proves Miss Collins' guilt beyond question." Miss Marple smiled faintly, eyes on the fading light. "Proof, Reverend, is a very comforting word, but comfort and truth are not always the same thing." He looked uncertain. "Then you don't believe she did it?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, pausing at the gate, "that whoever truly poisoned Mr. Ridley never expected him to die so quickly, and that, my dear Reverend, is the most revealing thing of all." The evening breeze rustled the yews, and the church bell chimed the hour. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The village would sleep that night believing justice was already done, but Miss Marple knew the story was only beginning to unfold, thread by thread, in the quiet way truth always does when it. That night, the village lay beneath a moon as pale as milk, its streets silent save for the soft hoot of an owl in the churchyard yew. In her cottage on the high street, Miss Marple sat awake by the fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The flames threw a flickering glow upon her face, calm and thoughtful. To an onlooker, she might have seemed the very picture of domestic tranquility, but her mind was anything but still. She had been turning over, in that quiet and methodical way of hers, every piece of conversation she'd had since the garden party. Little phrases that others had tossed away without thought returned to her now with peculiar sharpness. The Colonel's indignation at being questioned about Burma, Mrs. Hargreaves's confession that Ridley had inquired into her late husband's legal affairs, the tremor in Vera's hands when she poured that final cup. Each was a thread, and Miss Marple, being who she was, could not rest until the threads were woven into a pattern that made sense. It troubled her deeply that the inspector had closed the matter so swiftly. She had seen that sort of efficiency before, tidy conclusions preferred over uncomfortable truths. Yet it was the tidiness itself that disturbed her most. Crimes of passion were rarely so neat, and human nature, her lifelong study, was untidy by definition. She rose from her chair, crossed to the writing desk, and withdrew a small notebook bound in faded blue cloth. In it, she began to jot her observations in her precise, looping script. 1. Mr. Ridley, inquisitive, journalist, seeking old secrets. 2. Mrs. Hargreaves's late husband, solicitor, handled sensitive matters. 3. Vera Collins, once a nurse, capable of handling medicines, yet appears frightened, not guilty. 4. Colonel Latham, subject of Mr. Ridley's questioning, defensive. 5. Dr. Baines's cabinet shows no sign of forced entry. 6. Digitalis administered through tea poured from Mrs. Hargreaves' pot, spout dull, possibly tempered. She underlined that last phrase. The spout. Such a small detail, but then Miss Marple had always said that life's greatest tragedies often hinged on the smallest things. A misplaced key, an overheard word, or a polished silver handle with a tarnished spout. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a call on the police station in Market Chipping, ostensibly to bring Inspector Graves a basket of scones for his poor men working so hard. The inspector, already harried with paperwork, received her with stiff politeness. "Miss Marple, I must say this is most kind, but really, you oughtn't trouble yourself over this business any further. It's in hand now. We'll have Miss Collins up before the magistrate by the week's end." Miss Marple smiled sweetly, seating herself uninvited. "Oh, I do admire efficiency, Inspector. But I can't help thinking, do you remember that dreadful case in Gossington a few years back? The one where the housemaid confessed because she thought she'd killed her employer, when in fact the poor man had been dead of quite another cause. It caused the police no end of embarrassment, I believe." The inspector's expression hardened. "With respect, madam, this is not Gossington, and I have conclusive evidence, a bottle of digitalis from the accused's possession, and a motive plain as day. Mr. Ridley had been threatening to expose Miss Collins' past. We have letters to prove it." "Letters?" she asked softly. "How remarkable. I didn't know journalists wrote such things in advance of their own murders." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "Only that a man like Mr. Ridley, fond of secrets, would hardly warn a woman he intended to expose her. He would dangle the knowledge first, perhaps use it to gain something. Power, money, influence." Inspector Graves rubbed his chin, irritated despite himself. "You think someone else wrote the letters?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that people are often cleverer than we give them credit for when they're afraid of losing what they've built. And fear, Inspector, has a funny way of making the innocent seem guilty." When she left, the inspector was frowning into his papers, half annoyed, half intrigued. She knew he would not thank her for meddling, but she also knew curiosity was a police officer's greatest vice. He would check the handwriting. She was sure of it, and in doing so, perhaps he'd see what she had begun to suspect. From the station, Miss Marple went straight to Hawthorne Grange. The house had taken on a haunted stillness. Mrs. Hargreaves greeted her like a woman adrift, clutching a letter in trembling fingers. "Jane, it's dreadful. They say Vera has confessed." "Confessed?" Miss Marple echoed, taking the letter. "How very odd. May I?" Mrs. Hargreaves nodded tearfully. The note was short, written in a hurried, uneven hand. "I'm sorry for what I have done. I didn't mean for it to happen. Please forgive me." Miss Marple read it twice before returning it. "Forgive me, my dear, but this does not sound like Miss Collins at all. She has a steady hand and clear script. This looks rather more like someone copying a hand they only half remember." Mrs. Hargreaves looked startled. "But who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple set her teacup down delicately. "Someone who wants the case to be over quickly. Someone frightened enough to believe that silence is safety. You mustn't worry, Penelope. I think we shall soon know the truth." She stayed a while longer, chatting of ordinary things. The weather, the roses, the vicar's latest sermon, before excusing herself. Yet even as she walked down the drive, she could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes upon her. She turned once, sharply. No one was visible, but the faintest rustle came from the hedgerow near the gate, as if someone had stepped back just in time. By late afternoon, she made her way to the rectory, where the Reverend Miles received her in his book-lined study. "Ah, Miss Marple, how good of you to call. I've been thinking much of what you said, that the guilty one never meant him to die so soon, Sati. But what makes you say that?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because digitalis, taken in tea, does not act instantly, not unless the dose is monstrous, and Mr. Ridley collapsed almost at once. No one intending murder would risk such immediacy. No, I fancy someone tampered with that pot for quite another reason, perhaps to frighten him, or to make him ill enough to keep quiet." "Keep quiet about what?" "Ah," she said, eyes glimmering, "that is the question. Tell me, Reverend, did Mr. Ridley ever call upon you privately?" "Once," he admitted. "He asked to see the parish register, said he was tracing the history of certain local families for an article. I saw no harm in it. He seemed fascinated by the Hargreaves lineage, particularly the late Mr. Hargreaves' sister, who died many years ago under rather sad circumstances." Miss Marple's expression grew grave. "Indeed, I recall something about that, a scandal hushed up, if memory serves, and if Mr. Ridley learned of it, he might have seen an opportunity to exploit it." The Reverend paled. "You mean blackmail?" "Perhaps, or something very like it." When she left the rectory, dusk had fallen again, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and rain. The first lights flickered in cottage windows. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind alive with connections forming like threads in a tapestry. The past was returning to Little Hawthorne, she thought, and it had come disguised as journalism. Back in her parlour, she took up her knitting once more, though her thoughts were far away. Somewhere in the rhythm of her needles, she heard the whisper of truth. If her suspicions were correct, then Miss Collins was not only innocent, but had been made the scapegoat for a crime more subtle than poison. It was not yet clear who had wielded the true hand, but Miss Marple had seen enough of life to recognize deceit when it smiled politely over tea. She set her knitting aside, extinguished the lamp, and looked once more out her window at the darkened street. The same owl hooted again, and somewhere a shutter closed. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to Colonel Latham. Not as a curious old lady this time, but as someone who already knew far more than she would ever admit aloud. Morning came quietly, a soft veil of mist blurring the outlines of Little Hawthorne as if the village itself wished to hide from scrutiny. Dew clung to the rose bushes outside Miss Marple's cottage, and the air was heavy with that peculiar stillness which precedes a revelation. Inside, Miss Marple was fastening her brooch before the mirror, her reflection calm, her thoughts sharply alive. The decision she had made the night before, to visit Colonel Latham, was not one taken lightly. He was, she knew, a man proud of his respectability, and respectability often concealed more than it revealed. She arrived at his cottage just after 10. The path was gravelled, the garden immaculately trimmed, the flag fluttering faintly over the porch. The colonel himself answered the door, dressed as always, as though expecting an inspection parade. His expression softened at the sight of her. "Ah, Miss Marple. Do come in, ma'am. A pleasure, as always. You'll forgive the state of things. Can't seem to find decent help these days." The hallway was spotless, the scent of polish faintly overpowering. She was ushered into a drawing-room filled with regimental photographs, brass ornaments, and the faint aroma of pipe tobacco. "How good of you to see me, Colonel," Miss Marple said pleasantly, settling herself on the edge of a chair. "I've been so distressed by all this dreadful business. Poor Miss Collins, such a dear girl, and to think she should be accused of something so horrid." He harumphed, waving a hand. "Terrible affair. Yes, yes. But between you and me, Miss Marple, the girl's as guilty as sin. Never trust the quiet ones, that's what I say. Always hiding something behind those calm faces." Miss Marple regarded him mildly. Indeed, you may be right, though I wonder, what would she have to gain? It seems Mr. Ridley was rather more a nuisance than a threat, unless, of course, he knew something best left unspoken. The Colonel's pipe clattered faintly against the hearth. What do you mean by that? Oh, just idle talk, she said, smiling. One hears such things in small villages. Mr. Ridley was, I gather, asking questions about old times. Your service abroad, for instance. Burma, wasn't it? Such fascinating stories those must be. He was quite determined, I understand, to publish something about the people of Little Hawthorne and their remarkable histories. The Colonel's face darkened slightly. The man had no business poking into other people's affairs. A journalist, Miss Marple, is a parasite who feeds on gossip and misery. I told him so myself. You did? How very frank of you, she said softly. And may I ask, was that before or after the garden party? He hesitated. Before, naturally. The week prior. He came to see me, uninvited, I might add, at breakfast. Asked about an old case my regiment was involved in. Accused me, can you believe it, of misconduct. Said he had evidence. Filthy nonsense. Evidence, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. And what did you say? I told him to get out, that if he printed a word of it, I'd have him up for slander. The man was bluffing, I'm sure of it. No proof, no witnesses. But, he added, his tone dropping, he knew names. Names he shouldn't have known. Miss Marple's knitting fingers twitched faintly, though her needles were nowhere in sight. Names, she murmured. Yes, that would make him dangerous. Dangerous enough to be silenced, perhaps? He turned sharply toward her, eyes narrowing. Surely you don't think I... Good heavens, Miss Marple. She smiled, gentle as ever. Oh no, Colonel. I'm merely thinking aloud, but one must admit, it's curious how many people Mr. Ridley managed to alarm before his death. I dare say he was not lacking in enemies. The Colonel rose abruptly, muttering something about the time. She took her leave soon after, walking back through the village with the faintest frown creasing her brow. She had not gone to accuse him, merely to observe, and what she had seen in that fleeting, nervous reaction told her far more than words ever could. Colonel Latham feared exposure still, though not perhaps for Ridley's death. No, his fear had a deeper root, one that tied him to the undercurrent of secret stirring beneath Little Hawthorne's polished veneer. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage again, finding the Reverend Miles at his writing desk. The room smelled faintly of dust and paper, and sunlight filtered through the lace curtains in soft, dappled patterns. He looked up, surprised but pleased to see her. My dear Miss Marple, I was just thinking of you. Have you heard? Inspector Graves is sending the confession to the Crown Court. He says it's an open and shut case now. Miss Marple sighed. I'm afraid that phrase always makes me uneasy, Reverend. Life is rarely open and shut, especially where the human heart is concerned. The vicar folded his hands, uncertain. You still believe Miss Collins innocent, then? I do. Not out of sentiment, but because the evidence is too convenient. Confessions can be written, letters forged, bottles planted. No one has asked the most important question, why the poison acted so swiftly. You mean there might have been more than one source, or more than one intent, Miss Marple replied. You see, Reverend, digitalis was certainly in the tea, but I wonder whether it was there to kill or merely to warn. A warning can be deadly if the wrong person takes the wrong cup. He looked troubled. Then you think the poison wasn't meant for Mr. Ridley? She smiled faintly. I think it very possible that Mr. Ridley was never the intended victim at all. The Reverend sat back, stunned into silence, and for a moment the ticking clock was the only sound in the room. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a short note and sent it by the baker's boy to Inspector Graves, requesting a word the next morning at Hawthorne Grange. It was a simple message, written in her careful hand. I believe the teapot holds more answers than have yet been sought. Kindly bring it with you. The following day dawned bright and brittle. the kind of morning that carried the crispness of truth waiting to be uncovered. Miss Marple stood once again in Mrs. Hargreaves's parlour, where the inspector, impatient but obliging, arrived bearing the sealed box that contained the silver teapot. "Really, Miss Marple, I can't imagine what good this will do," he grumbled. "We've already had the laboratory test it." "Yes, I know," she said mildly. "But tell me, Inspector, did they test the spout?" "The spout? What on earth for?" She smiled. "You see, the poison could not have been mixed directly into the pot. Mrs. Hargreaves poured several cups before Mr. Ridley's, and none were harmed. It must have been introduced at the spout, perhaps by means of a small residue hidden within. A dab of tincture, dried and invisible until hot liquid passed through. Quite enough to poison one cup, and one only." The inspector blinked. "By heaven, you're right. But who?" "Someone who poured the cup last," Miss Marple said softly. "Someone who knew which cup was meant for whom." Her eyes flicked toward Mrs. Hargreaves, who stood trembling at the window, white as the lace curtain she clutched. "Penelope," Miss Marple said gently, "I think you had no intention of killing him, only of silencing him, frightening him, perhaps, into leaving well enough alone. You thought to warn him with a faint illness, not death. But you poured the wrong cup." The teapot slipped from Mrs. Hargreaves' grasp with a faint clatter. The inspector started forward, but Miss Marple raised a calming hand. "He was threatening to publish the truth about your late husband's dealings, wasn't he? That his firm had concealed the mishandling of a client's estate." Vera knew, of course. She'd seen the letters, but she said nothing. Loyalty is a rare virtue. Mrs. Hargreaves gave a low, broken sob. "I didn't mean to. Oh, Jane, I only wanted to scare him. He said he'd ruin my husband's name, drag it through the mud. Everything we built, destroyed." Miss Marple took her hand gently. "Yes, dear. But fear is a poor servant and a dreadful master. It makes us do the very thing we dread." The inspector's notebook trembled in his fingers as he looked between them. "Good Lord," he muttered. "To think of it. Poison meant for warning." Miss Marple nodded faintly, eyes filled with quiet sadness. "Murder rarely begins with intent, Inspector. More often it begins with desperation and a teapot polished just a little too well." Outside, the church bells began to ring, slow and solemn, as if the village itself mourned not only the dead man, but the peace that would never quite return. Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the mist rise over the hedgerows, and thought, not without pity, how human frailty had again shown itself, in the most genteel and ordinary of places, over the most civilized of acts. The pouring of tea. The silence that followed Mrs. Hargreaves' confession lingered like a chill draught through the drawing-room. Even the clock upon the mantel seemed hesitant to strike. Miss Marple stood very still, her expression composed, but in her eyes was a weary compassion that only deepened as the widow's trembling words faded into sobs. Inspector Graves, clearing his throat awkwardly, turned away to the window as though unwilling to witness the small collapse of pride that comes when a well-bred woman's veneer finally gives way. It was not triumph Miss Marple felt. Never triumph, but rather that quiet sorrow she always carried when the mask of civility was torn to reveal the frightened soul beneath. She laid a gentle hand on Mrs. Hargreaves' arm, feeling the frail bones beneath her silk sleeve. "It is finished now, Penelope," she said softly. "There's no undoing what has been done, but at least the truth has stepped into daylight, and that, in its way, is mercy." Mrs. Hargreaves shook her head miserably. "You don't understand, Jane. It wasn't just my husband's name I was protecting. There was someone else. Someone he wronged dreadfully. Ridley had found it out. He said he meant to tell her, to publish everything. I couldn't bear it. Not again." Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. "Her?" "Yes," Mrs. Hargreaves whispered, lowering her gaze. "A woman named Edith Latham." For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then the name settled in the air like a faint echo that had been waiting years to be heard. Miss Marple's fingers stilled upon the widow's hand. "Latham," she repeated. "Colonel Latham's late wife?" Mrs. Hargreaves nodded, tears streaking her powdered cheeks. "Her father's estate was mishandled by my husband's firm. There were irregularities in the accounts, never proved, but known. Edith's dowry vanished, her family ruined. She died in bitterness, and her husband—" She paused, swallowing hard. "He never forgave the Hargreaves name. And now, all these years later, Ridley came poking about, asking questions. He found the papers my husband thought destroyed." Inspector Graves turned sharply. "You mean to say Colonel Latham knew about this?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said quietly, her mind already tracing the new pattern forming before her. "He knew, or at least suspected. And Mr. Ridley's death has rid him of the one man who might have revived the scandal. How very fortunate for him." Graves' eyes narrowed. "You think he's involved?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that human motives are rarely solitary. When one stone falls, others roll with it." Mrs. Hargreaves moaned softly. No, you mustn't drag Geoffrey into this. He'd never—" But her voice faltered under Miss Marple's steady gaze. "He came to see me, the night before the party," she admitted at last. "He said I ought to persuade Ridley to drop his inquiries. He was furious. Said the man had blackmailed him once already. I thought he was just being dramatic. I never dreamed—" Miss Marple's eyes, sharp now beneath their gentle blue, caught the inspector's. "You see, Graves, this is not as simple as you hoped. Mrs. Hargreaves may have poured the tea, but I doubt she alone brewed the trouble." The inspector bristled but said nothing, and when he finally left to make his report, the air in the room felt heavy with things unspoken. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, adjusting her gloves as Mrs. Hargreaves sat, hollow-eyed, staring at the untouched tea service. "Penelope," Miss Marple said softly, "do you recall if Colonel Latham drank tea that day?" The widow blinked in confusion. No, I don't think he did. He had whiskey, as usual." "Why?" "Oh, no reason, really," said Miss Marple, though her voice held a thoughtful lilt. "Only one learns to pay attention to small abstentions. They often speak louder than indulgences." Outside, the day had turned brisk, a wind scattering brown leaves along the lane as Miss Marple made her way home. The world, she reflected, was a strange balance of appearances. The polished manners, the Sunday smiles, the deference to propriety, all thin veils over passions that time could never quite extinguish. Colonel Latham, it seemed, had far more reason to fear exposure than Mrs. Hargreaves. Yet it was the widow's conscience that had cracked first. Guilt and fear made an unholy marriage, she thought, but pride was the efficient that bound them. When she reached her cottage, she found a note waiting on her doorstep, folded neatly beneath a pebble. The handwriting was brisk, masculine, Dr. Baines's. "Call upon me at once. Urgent matter concerning Miss Collins." Miss Marple frowned. The doctor's neat precision rarely strayed into alarm. She wasted no time walking briskly through the village lanes until she reached his surgery. He was waiting by the fire, pale and flustered. "Thank goodness you've come," he said. "The girl, Miss Collins, has taken ill in the cell. They think it's shock, but I'm not so sure. I went to see her, and she was babbling, half delirious, about someone warning her, telling her to keep quiet or she'd end up like Ridley." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "She said that? When?" "Just this morning, before they moved her to the infirmary. Poor thing's barely coherent, but she kept repeating the same phrase. I thought you'd want to know." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "I most certainly do." She sank into a chair, her mind whirring quietly behind its calm facade. The pieces were moving again. If Vera had been threatened, then someone had needed her silence, and that someone had known she was innocent. "Doctor," she said after a moment, "did you notice anything unusual in her symptoms?" He frowned. only that she seemed oddly flushed, heart racing, shallow breath. Frankly, it reminded me of a mild dose of digitalis poisoning, but that's impossible. She couldn't have had access to it. Miss Marple's lips thinned. Impossible things, Doctor, have a way of occurring when truth is cornered. Might I see her? He hesitated, then nodded. They've moved her to the infirmary by the constable's office. But be careful. Inspector Graves won't like anyone meddling. Oh, I never meddle, said Miss Marple with a gentle smile. I merely observe. An hour later, she was seated beside Vera Collins' narrow bed, watching the young woman's pale face stir beneath the weight of fever. Her eyelids fluttered, and when she spoke, her voice was faint but clear enough. Miss Marple, I never meant to hide it. Hush, dear, Miss Marple said softly, taking her hand. No one thinks you did. But you must tell me. Who warned you? The girl's lips trembled. A note slipped under my door the night before the party. It said, "Keep quiet about what you saw, or you'll regret it." I thought it was Mr. Ridley. I didn't tell anyone. And what did you see, Vera? A long pause. Then, with effort, the girl whispered, "Someone in the study. Late that night, with the silver teapot." I thought it was Mrs. Hargreaves, but when the lamp flickered, I saw a man's hand. Miss Marple leaned closer, her heart tightening. A man's hand? Yes, she breathed. A man's, with a signet ring, a crest, a lion. The whisper faded, her eyes closing again in exhaustion. Miss Marple sat back, her own pulse quickening. A lion, the Latham crest. Outside, dusk had gathered once more over the village, and Miss Marple stepped into the street with the certainty that the game was not yet done. She could almost hear Colonel Latham's bluff, hearty laugh echoing in her memory. The same laugh he had used to dismiss Ridley's probing questions. It was a laugh, she realized now, meant to drown out the sound of fear. By the time she reached her cottage, the first lamps were glowing in the windows of Little Hawthorne, casting warm light upon faces that hid too much. Miss Marple paused at her gate, looking out toward the Colonel's house beyond the green. The truth was near. She could feel it like the tightening of a thread between her fingers. Soon, with one gentle tug, all the tangled knots would give way. Inside, she sat once more before her cold hearth, lighting the fire with deliberate care. The flames rose, catching the light in her eyes. It was not the widow's trembling confession that had stayed with her, nor the poor girl's whispered terror. It was the image of a man polishing a signet ring with practiced ease, as if scrubbing away not the tarnish of silver, but of conscience. That night the wind rose again, whistling through the hedgerows like a restless spirit. Miss Marple sat by her fire, the glow soft on her pale face, her eyes fixed not on the flames, but on the thoughts flickering behind them. The image of the signet ring lingered in her mind, a lion engraved upon gold, the crest of the Latham family. It was the sort of detail that most would overlook, but Miss Marple had long since learned that the smallest things were often the truest. A ring was not merely ornament. It was identity, heritage, pride, and in this case, perhaps, guilt. The following morning dawned clear and cold. Frost glazed the grass, and Little Hawthorne lay still, its inhabitants stirring slowly from uneasy dreams. Miss Marple rose early, her movements calm and deliberate. She had always believed that a puzzle, once nearing its solution, demanded patience, not haste. So she took her tea, fed her sparrows, and then set out for Colonel Latham's cottage with the same quiet purpose as if she were paying an ordinary social call. The Colonel received her with blustering civility, though she thought she detected a flicker of irritation at her persistence. He had the look of a man who had not slept well. His eyes were shadowed, his hands, those broad, disciplined hands, shook slightly as he poured the morning whiskey he pretended was just for the chill. The gold ring on his finger caught the light as he lifted the glass, and for a brief instant Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it. "You'll forgive me for intruding again, Colonel," she said pleasantly, settling herself near the fire. "I wanted to ask you something rather delicate. It concerns Miss Collins." He stiffened. "That wretched girl? I thought her guilt settled." "I'm afraid the matter is not so simple," Miss Marple replied. "The inspector is most thorough, but sometimes in his eagerness to tie up loose ends, he overlooks the finer threads." Latham gave a dry laugh. "You think I'm one of those threads, do you? My dear lady, I've had my share of unpleasant rumors, but I assure you I've no hand in this village melodrama." "Oh, I would never suggest such a thing," she said with mildness that somehow made the words sharper. "Only, it does puzzle me how Mr. Ridley came to know so much about you. He seemed remarkably informed about a matter long buried." The Colonel's expression tightened. "The man was a scavenger. He dug into things better left forgotten. Yes, he came to me, demanded money, threatened exposure, but he left empty-handed, I'll tell you that." "Did he?" she asked softly. "And yet, within a day of his death, you appeared at Mrs. Hargreaves' party, quite at ease, though you must have known he'd be there. You even took the liberty of standing near the tea-table, did you not?" He looked at her sharply. "You've been talking to people." "I do listen," said Miss Marple gently, "and I remember things. For instance, that Mrs. Hargreaves poured tea for everyone except you. You refused it. You had whiskey instead. Rather unusual, I thought, for so early in the day." He gave a short, uneasy laugh. "Old habits die hard. The army, you know. Tea never agreed with me." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said, her voice almost wistful, "though I wonder if it wasn't the tea you distrusted that afternoon, but the teapot." For the first time, his eyes flickered away from hers. The silence between them deepened. She went on, her tone still soft, but now deliberate. "You see, Vera Collins told me something before she fell ill. She saw someone in Mrs. Hargreaves' study the night before the party, a man, not a woman, and she recognized a ring, your ring, Colonel, a lion rampant upon gold." He rose abruptly, knocking over his glass. The liquid pooled darkly on the polished table. "Ridiculous! The girl's hysterical, half out of her mind. I wasn't there." Miss Marple did not move. "No, I think you were. You knew Mrs. Hargreaves meant to warn Ridley off. Perhaps you encouraged it. Perhaps you even supplied her with advice or a substance to give him that warning. Digitalis, perhaps, from Dr. Baines's cabinet, where you still had a key from your time on the Parish Health Committee." His face had gone very white. "You're guessing." "I rarely guess," she said softly. "I observe. You see, I've known many men like you, Colonel. Brave in the field, upright in appearance, but terrified of disgrace. When you realized Mrs. Hargreaves' frightened attempt at warning might backfire, you tampered with the pot yourself. A few drops through the spout, enough to make Ridley ill. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. He drank more than you intended, and the dose was fatal." He stared at her, breathing hard. "You've no proof. Not a shred." Miss Marple's eyes, pale and clear, rested on his trembling hand. "Oh, but I think there is proof, on that ring. You were polishing it yesterday, weren't you? I noticed the scratches. Silver polish leaves traces under the nails, especially when one scrubs too hard. You were trying to remove the residue. Digitalis stains, faint but persistent. The laboratory will find it if they look." For a long moment, the Colonel said nothing. The tick of the mantel clock filled the silence. Then, with a sudden, almost pitiful slump, he sank into the chair opposite her, the facade of bluster gone. "You don't understand," he said hoarsely. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I told her just to frighten him, to make him leave, but she lost her nerve, and I couldn't let him ruin us both. My wife's name, my regiment, the whole damned thing. It would have destroyed me. You can't imagine what scandal does to a man who's lived his life by honor." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet pity. "Honor, Colonel, is a curious thing. It demands courage, but not always the kind one learns in uniform." He bowed his head. "So what now?" "I shall speak to Inspector Graves," she said softly. "He'll be fair. Mrs. Hargreaves's guilt was never complete, nor is yours. Between you brewed something neither of you truly intended. But justice, like tea, must be served while it's still warm." When she left him, the morning sunlight had brightened into something harsh, stripping the frost from the hedges. The world seemed painfully vivid, as it always did after truth emerged from shadow. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the village, her steps steady despite the weight of what she had heard. She thought of Mrs. Hargreaves in her grief, of Vera Collins recovering from her fever, and of the Colonel, broken at last beneath the weight of a past he had spent years polishing, like the ring that had betrayed him. At her gate, she paused to watch the sparrows quarrel over crumbs, their tiny voices rising above the stillness. Such ordinary life continued, heedless of tragedy, and that, she thought, was the way of the world, one moment filled with laughter over tea, the next with whispered confessions and ruined names. Later, as the sun dipped behind the church spire, Inspector Graves arrived at her cottage, hat in hand. "You were right again, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "We found traces on the ring, exactly as you said. He's given a full statement." She only nodded, her gaze resting on the fading light beyond the window. "The truth," she said at last, "has a way of finding its way into the open, Inspector. Like sunlight through lace curtains. It shows the dust we'd rather not see." That evening, as she sat once more by her fire, her knitting resumed its steady rhythm. The needles clicked softly, the flames danced low, and in the quiet comfort of her home, Miss Marple reflected, not for the first time, that human beings were infinitely more complex than any pattern she could knit. The design was always there, if one only knew how to read it. But it was woven with threads of fear, vanity, and the smallest, most dangerous of emotions. The desire to appear good. Outside, the wind had settled. The village slept again in its deceptive peace, unaware that its harmony had been stitched back together. Fragile, imperfect, but whole enough to endure until the next storm. The following days passed in a strange hush, as though little Hawthorne itself were reluctant to speak aloud of what had transpired. The newspapers from Market Chipping carried only a small column, "Retired officer confesses in village tragedy." But gossip, as Miss Marple well knew, needed no ink to spread. In the tea shops and grocers' queue, the villagers discussed it in whispers. How shocking it was, how impossible it seemed that a man so respected could stoop to deceit, and how, of course, Miss Marple had seen through it all from the very beginning. But Miss Marple herself felt no triumph. She had attended the brief hearing 2 mornings later, sitting quietly at the back while Colonel Latham, gaunt and subdued, stood beside his solicitor. There had been no dramatics, no outburst, just a broken voice admitting his guilt and a weary silence that followed. When the magistrate spoke of remand and further inquiries, Miss Marple's thoughts were already elsewhere. It was not the Colonel she pitied most, but Mrs. Hargreaves, whose pale figure had appeared at the edge of the courtroom, veiled and trembling, her loyalty to the man who had destroyed her unbroken to the last. It was later that afternoon, as Miss Marple returned along the quiet road to her cottage, that she noticed a familiar figure waiting by her gate. Dr. Bain stood there, hat in hand, his expression troubled. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said. "I'm glad to catch you. There's something rather unsettling I thought you should know." She gave him her mild, encouraging smile. "Unsettling news, Doctor. Tends to travel faster than we'd like. Come in and tell me." Inside, he perched awkwardly on the edge of the armchair, his spectacles glinting in the lamplight. "It's about Colonel Latham," he began. The inspector sent word this morning. He's dead. Miss Marple's knitting slipped from her lap. Dead? The doctor nodded gravely. Collapsed in his cell late last night. Heart failure, they say, though the timing is, well, extraordinary, given everything. She folded her hands slowly. Yes, extraordinary indeed. Did the inspector mention if anything unusual occurred beforehand? He hesitated. Only that the colonel had been given a meal brought in from the constable's quarters. Nothing remarkable. Roast beef, vegetables, tea. He complained of feeling faint not long after. I've seen the report. It could very well be natural causes. The man was under strain. Or, Miss Marple murmured, the strain was made convenient. The doctor frowned. You think someone? She shook her head gently. I think only that the pattern is not yet complete. Poisoning is a very particular form of violence, Doctor. It appeals to those who prefer control to confrontation. And little Hawthorne, I fear, has not yet exhausted its capacity for quiet malice. He sighed, half resigned. You've the instincts of a bloodhound, Miss Marple. But for once, I hope you're wrong. After he left, the cottage felt colder than before. Miss Marple rose, lit another candle, and stood by the window, looking out at the frost-laced garden. The wind rattled faintly against the panes. She thought of the colonel's last words to her, that his wife's name, his regiment, his honor had been everything. Yet even dishonorable men rarely carried poison to the grave willingly. No, his death had the air of orchestration about it. Too swift, too tidy, too convenient for those who might wish the affair closed entirely. She made her way to the small writing desk, drew out her notebook, and wrote a single line beneath her previous observations. The silenced do not always silence themselves. That evening, she received a visitor. Vera Collins, pale but recovered, arrived wrapped in a borrowed shawl, her eyes still heavy from recent illness. Miss Marple welcomed her with warmth, pressing a cup of tea into her hands. You're looking stronger, my dear. That's good to see. Vera smiled faintly. Thanks to you, Miss Marple. I don't think I'd be here otherwise. They released me yesterday morning. Inspector Graves was kind enough to drive me back himself. I'm glad to hear it, Miss Marple said, watching her closely. And how is Mrs. Hargreaves? Vera's expression clouded. Not well. She blames herself, of course. She's gone to stay with her sister in Bath. I don't think she'll ever set foot in Little Hawthorne again. There was a long pause, the fire crackling softly. Then Vera added hesitantly, You've heard about the colonel. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Dr. Baines told me. I imagine it must have been a shock. Vera looked down at her teacup. I can't say I'm surprised. He was haunted, even before the confession. When I saw him last, he seemed afraid of something more than punishment. He said to me, It's not over yet, Miss Collins. I didn't understand what he meant. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice low but intent. Tell me, my dear, did you notice anything unusual that evening? Anything at all? Vera frowned, thinking. Only that someone came to see him just before he was taken away. I heard them speaking through the open window of the constable's office. It was Inspector Graves who arranged it, I think. Said the man was a solicitor. But when I looked, it wasn't anyone from the court. It was Dr. Baines. Miss Marple's eyes did not widen, but a faint tightening came at the corners of her mouth. Dr. Baines, are you quite certain? Yes, Vera said quickly. He carried his bag, but he didn't stay long. Perhaps 10 minutes. Afterwards, he left by the side door, and the colonel never looked the same again. I thought it strange. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the fire. Yes, she murmured. Strange indeed. When Vera had gone, Miss Marple remained seated long after the door had closed behind her. She replayed the morning's conversation with Dr. Baines, his hesitance, his choice of words, the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow despite the cold. He had been nervous, yes, but not in the way of a man disturbed by tragedy. Rather, in the way of one awaiting confirmation that his own deceit had gone unnoticed. Her mind turned back to the earlier days of the affair. Dr. Baines had been the first on the scene at the garden party, quick to declare Mr. Ridley dead. He had also been the one to examine the teapot, to identify the poison, to pronounce that it could only have come from his own surgery. A small circle of authority surrounded him then. No one had questioned his conclusions. And if one wished to steer suspicion, well, who better than the village doctor, custodian of both secrets and remedies? By the time the clock struck 11, Miss Marple had reached her decision. She wrapped a shawl about her shoulders, lit her lantern, and set off toward the surgery. The night was crisp, her breath visible in the air. She moved with careful purpose, her steps almost silent along the frost-hardened road. The surgery window glowed faintly. Ahead, through the glass, she could see Dr. Baines at his desk, writing. His head was bowed, the lamplight catching the thinning silver of his hair. She tapped gently on the door. He started slightly, then opened it with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Marple, out so late, surely not on my account." "I'm afraid so, Doctor," she said mildly, stepping inside. "I've been troubled by something you said this morning. You told me the Colonel's death was natural, yet you also mentioned his symptoms resembled digitalis poisoning. How very coincidental." The smile faltered. "Coincidental, yes. But you know how the imagination plays tricks after such an ordeal." "Indeed it does," she said softly, "especially when one's imagination has had practice. I recall your remark at the garden party, that you could recognize digitalis poisoning anywhere. Such confidence, Doctor, is admirable, unless one's familiarity stems from more than professional study." He drew himself up. "Now see here, Miss Marple." But her gaze held him, calm and unwavering. "Mr. Ridley was not your patient, was he? Yet he'd been investigating you as well as Mrs. Hargreaves. I found that quite curious. You see, my dear doctor, he had learned something about an old case, your handling of Miss Edith Latham's father's illness. A dosage miscalculated, a death too soon, a certificate quietly signed. Mrs. Hargreaves's husband covered it up for you, I believe, and when Ridley discovered the truth, he became dangerous to both you and the Colonel." Baines's hand trembled on the back of his chair. "You can't prove that." "No," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle as ever. "But the police can, and they will, once they test the Colonel's tea for a second time." For a moment, he simply stared at her. Then, with a slow, defeated motion, he sank into his chair, his face gray and hollow. "He said he couldn't bear prison," he whispered. "He begged me for something to calm him. I only meant to give him peace." Miss Marple sighed softly. "Yes, Doctor, but peace won that way is always borrowed, and the debt comes due." When she left the surgery, dawn was breaking pale and cold over the village roofs. The first birds were beginning to stir, their songs hesitant and thin in the frosty air. Miss Marple walked home quietly, her lantern swinging by her side. The case, at last, had run its course, not in one confession, but in several, each born from fear, vanity, or remorse. As she reached her gate, she paused to look back at the waking village. Smoke rose from chimneys, and somewhere a child laughed, small, bright sounds against the stillness. Life, as always, went on. Yet beneath its surface, Miss Marple knew, there lingered the faint, bitter aftertaste of poison. Not in the teapot now, but in memory, where it would steep forever. The morning after her visit to Dr. Baines, Miss Marple woke to the faint light of dawn seeping through her lace curtains. The air held the crisp promise of frost, and for a moment she sat still, listening to the gentle ticking of the mantel clock and the faraway toll of the church bell marking 7. It was a peaceful sound, but beneath it lay an unease that she could not shake. Peace in Little Hawthorne, she had learned, was often only the hush that follows confession, and even then, not always an honest one. Her fire had gone out during the night, so she set about lighting it anew, the small domestic ritual steadying her thoughts. The previous evening had closed upon Dr. Baines's quiet, broken admission, half confession, half excuse. He had spoken of mercy, of sparing the Colonel's suffering. And yet Miss Marple could not help but hear, between his trembling words, the faint note of self-preservation. Guilt, she knew, often dressed itself as kindness when it wished to be forgiven too easily. By 8 o'clock she had decided what must be done. The truth, she reflected, was rarely tidy, and though she had gathered all its scattered fragments, she could not yet see the whole picture complete. The Colonel had been poisoned, yes, but not by chance, and not solely by the doctor's trembling hand. There were layers still, motives and fears that wound back further than even Dr. Baines's confession revealed. When Inspector Graves arrived at her cottage not an hour later, his hat pulled low and his expression tired, she greeted him with a pot of strong tea and a plate of buttered scones. He looked, as she observed mildly, rather like a man who's been chasing ghosts. He gave a short laugh. "You've got a way of putting it, Miss Marple. But yes, ghosts is the right word. The coroner's report came through this morning. Traces of digitalis again. The Colonel didn't die naturally. And as for Baines, he's vanished." Miss Marple's hands did not falter as she poured the tea. "Vanished, Inspector? Gone sometime in the night. His surgery's empty, bag and all. We've sent word to the county police, but it's as though the ground swallowed him." He took the cup she handed him and sighed heavily. "You are right again. You always are. The man's guilty as sin." "Perhaps," she said softly. "But perhaps not quite in the way you think. There's guilt of the act, Inspector, and guilt of the cause. Sometimes one precedes the other by years." He frowned, but she went on before he could speak. "Tell me, did you happen to search the Colonel's belongings before the doctor's disappearance?" "Of course. Standard procedure. Letters, papers, nothing out of the ordinary. Except—" He hesitated, drawing a folded sheet from his coat pocket. "Except for this. Found it tucked in the lining of his uniform jacket. I can't make heads or tails of it." She accepted the paper and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was firm, elegant, unmistakably the Colonel's. It read only a few lines. "The debt was not mine alone. One death paid for another. If you find this, you'll understand." Miss Marple's eyes lifted slowly from the page. "Ah," she said softly. "Yes, I thought as much." The inspector looked exasperated. "You thought what, exactly?" "That this matter began long before Mr. Ridley ever set foot in Little Hawthorne," she said, her tone calm, her eyes distant with memory. "It began when a young doctor made a mistake he dared not admit, and a solicitor chose to bury it. Two men bound by secrecy, later joined by a third who profited from both their guilt. Ridley only uncovered the last layer of the wound. They did the rest themselves." Graves rubbed his temple. "You mean to tell me they all had a hand in it?" "Of course they did. The past has a dreadful way of creating accomplices. When Baines overdosed Miss Latham's father years ago, Hargreaves concealed it to protect his firm. When the truth threatened to emerge, Latham, already embittered by his wife's ruin, saw his chance to silence both guilt and gossip. But what none of them counted on was Ridley. He was the final link. A man too clever, too curious, and, I suspect, too arrogant for his own safety. Once he realized the chain of deceit, it was only a matter of who would strike first." The inspector leaned forward. "And you believe Latham was the first?" "Yes, though not deliberately murderous. He meant to frighten Ridley, as Mrs. Hargreaves believed, but Baines gave him the means and underestimated his desperation. When the man died, the Colonel's panic forced Baines's hand again. 2 deaths, Inspector, each meant to hide the other. A very human pattern, I'm afraid." Graves shook his head slowly. It's diabolical, and yet they all thought they were saving themselves. Miss Marple smiled faintly, stirring her tea. Self-preservation is the oldest poison there is. He sat back with a sigh. We'll find Baines. Sooner or later, a man like that slips. What shall I tell the press this time? That an old lady solved the case again? Oh, I shouldn't think that necessary, she said gently. Tell them only that justice has a long memory, and that little Hawthorne will, I hope, be quieter now. When he had gone, she stood for a moment by the window, watching the inspector's car vanish down the lane. The morning sunlight was beginning to melt the frost, turning the hedgerows to silver. Yet despite the light, Miss Marple felt a shadow linger, a faint melancholy that clung to the air like the last echo of a storm. Later that afternoon, she took a slow walk through the village. The people she passed nodded politely, some with admiration, others with embarrassment. They all knew, of course, though few would ever speak of it directly. At the post office, Mrs. Finch leaned across the counter to whisper, "You must feel quite proud, Miss Marple, catching a murderer twice over." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "I don't believe one ever catches murder, my dear. It tends to catch itself sooner or later." She continued on toward the churchyard, where the last of the autumn leaves lay scattered across the graves. The air was cool and still, and for a long while she stood before the small stone cross newly placed for Mr. Ridley, paid for, she'd been told, by an anonymous benefactor, a journalist who had come seeking scandal, now memorialized by silence. There was a certain poetic irony in that, she thought. Footsteps crunched softly behind her. She turned to see Vera Collins, wrapped in her shawl, her eyes red but steady. "I wanted to thank you," the girl said quietly, "for believing me, for seeing what no one else did." Miss Marple touched her arm gently. "You needn't thank me, my dear. I only noticed what others chose not to see. That's not cleverness, just a matter of being old enough to have seen it all before." Vera hesitated, then looked toward the distant hills. "I'm leaving Little Hawthorne. There's a post in Bath, a companion's position. I think I need to start somewhere new." "That's wise," Miss Marple said softly. "Places, like people, can wear their histories too heavily." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer. The bells of St. Mildred's began to toll the hour, slow and solemn, their sound rolling over the fields like a benediction. She turned then and made her way home through the fading light, her steps unhurried, her thoughts drifting between sorrow and acceptance. By evening, the cottage was once again filled with the quiet comfort of routine. The kettle steaming, the knitting basket at her side, the small cat curled upon the hearthrug. The world beyond her walls would continue as it always did, with gossip and gardens and the endless brewing of tea. Yet beneath it all, she knew, the same truths endured, that evil seldom arrives with a shout, but with a smile and a cup extended, that sin wears the face of respectability, and that somewhere in every village, no matter how picturesque, there lies a heart waiting to be unmasked. Miss Marple laid down her knitting and looked into the fire, the faintest smile touching her lips. The flames crackled softly, and in their warmth she found neither triumph nor bitterness, only understanding. Human nature, she thought, would never change. And so long as it didn't, there would always be work for an old lady who listened carefully over tea. The next morning dawned soft and pale, the mist rising off the meadows like breath from some slumbering creature. The air was quiet again, that peculiar English quiet that follows tragedy, as though the earth itself were politely averting its gaze. Miss Marple sat by the window with her tea, the faint clink of porcelain the only sound in her tidy little cottage. She had slept poorly, her dreams muddled with faces, Mrs. Hargreaves weeping behind a veil, Colonel Latham's hand shaking as he held his glass, Dr. Baines's eyes clouded with a guilt too deep to be spoken. Even Mr. Ridley's sardonic smile had returned to her mind, not in accusation, but in some sad acknowledgment that the truth he'd chased had claimed him in the end. The village had already begun to settle itself again. The news of Bain's flight had caused a flurry of speculation. Mrs. Pollard swore he'd fled to France, and the grocer insisted he'd drowned himself in the river, but by morning both theories had faded under the soft weight of routine. Life, Miss Marple thought, had an extraordinary way of smoothing over its own rough edges. Even scandal, when allowed a few days, grew polite. She folded her hands around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. She ought to have felt relief. The case was over, the truth unearthed, and justice, in some imperfect fashion, done. Yet something in her mind refused to rest. The Colonel's letter still echoed in her thoughts. One death paid for another. Those words, so cryptic and resigned, had the unmistakable ring of confession, but also of warning. One death paid for another, but whose? A knock sounded on the door, soft but urgent. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and opened it to find Inspector Graves standing on her step, hat in hand, and his coat still damp from the morning fog. His expression was troubled. "Miss Marple," he began, "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but something rather strange has come up." "You never disturb me, Inspector," she said, ushering him inside. "Though from your tone, I expect it's not a social call." He gave a grim nod. "You might say that. We've found Baines." Her eyes lifted slightly. "Alive?" For the moment. A farmer spotted him at the old railway siding near Bracknell. Looked like he'd been sleeping rough. They brought him in last night. Weak, half delirious, kept muttering about atonement. He's in custody now, though the doctor's not sure he'll make it. Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea. "Atonement," she repeated softly. "That's a heavy word for a man who's spent his life avoiding it." Graves accepted the cup but did not drink. Before he lost consciousness, he said something odd. Claimed there was another letter, one he wrote after speaking to you. We searched the surgery and found it behind a loose panel in his desk. I thought you ought to see it before I send it to the Crown Office. He drew a folded sheet from his coat and handed it to her. Miss Marple took it carefully, the thin paper crackling faintly between her fingers. The handwriting was firm despite its hurried strokes. She read silently while Graves watched. "To whomever finds this, I cannot bear the burden of what I have done, but before I go, let it be known that the Colonel was not my only sin. Years ago I killed another, not by mistake, as I told myself, but to save my name. The man was my patient. I dosed him, twice what I should have, and when he died, I let another take the blame. I thought it buried. Now the past has come to collect its due. Forgive me, if you can. Henry Baines." Miss Marple's lips pressed together. She read it once more before setting it down beside the teapot. The ticking of the clock filled the silence. "So," Graves said quietly, "that ties it up neatly enough, doesn't it? A guilty man confessing to old crimes. I'll forward it along." But Miss Marple shook her head. "Not neatly, Inspector. Nothing about this affair has been neat. Tell me, did the Colonel know of this old murder?" Graves frowned. "I can't see how he could. What difference does it make?" "It makes all the difference," she replied softly. "Because the Colonel's letter, his talk of one death paying for another, suggests he knew something about Baines's past, something that bound them both long before Ridley's arrival. Perhaps he even believed that by silencing Ridley he was balancing a moral debt." He stared at her. "You think they were connected?" "I think," Miss Marple said, stirring her tea absently, "that human guilt is rarely solitary. It seeks company, someone to share its weight. The Colonel, Mrs. Hargreaves, Dr. Baines, they were all trapped in a chain of mutual protection, each one complicit in the other's concealment. When Ridley threatened that balance, the entire structure collapsed. But I suspect there was yet another thread. someone who stood to gain from keeping them quiet. Graves rubbed the back of his neck. You mean there's still someone else? Miss Marple looked up, her eyes calm but intent. Tell me, Inspector, who notified you of Baines's supposed disappearance? He blinked. What? The constable from Market Chipping. He said Mrs. Finch sent word when she saw the surgery dark. Why? Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost indulgent. Ah, yes. Mrs. Finch, a most reliable woman and one with an excellent memory for other people's business. She's been at the heart of every whisper in this village for 30 years. She knew who came, who went, who quarreled, and why. And she knew, I suspect, precisely what Baines feared most. Graves looked incredulous. You can't mean to say Mrs. Finch. I can, Miss Marple interrupted gently. You see, her late husband was the clerk who handled the estate of Miss Latham's father, the one ruined by Hargreaves' deception. She lost everything when that estate collapsed. She's lived ever since among those she blamed, hiding her resentment behind gossip. And who better to manipulate a frightened doctor than a woman who knows his secrets? It was she who fetched the medicine for him on the day of Ridley's death, wasn't it? She told me so herself, though she pretended it was an errand of kindness. The inspector's eyes widened as the realization dawned. Good Lord, you think she helped Baines poison Ridley? Helped, yes, but not as an accomplice in his plan, as the architect of her own. She rose from her chair and crossed to the window, her voice calm but firm. Revenge, Inspector, is a patient thing. Mrs. Finch watched them all, Baines, Hargreaves, Latham, grow comfortable while she lived quietly with her bitterness. When Ridley began stirring the past, she saw her chance. A pinch of powder in the wrong vial, a reminder slipped beneath a door, a whisper here and there. It would take very little to tip the balance. She need only watch as they destroyed one another. Graves let out a low whistle. You've got the devil's own insight, Miss Marple. Not the devil's, she said gently. Only a lifetime of observing human frailty. He stood slowly, straightening his coat. I'll have a word with her. If what you say is true, we may yet close this case properly. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat once more at her table, the fire crackling low beside her. She gazed down at the two letters, the colonel's and the doctor's, each written by a man who believed he could tidy his conscience with words. Yet both had left behind something ink could not cleanse. The truth, she reflected, was rather like tea. Once spilled, it stained everything it touched. Outside, the morning had ripened into sunlight, melting the last of the mist from the green. She could hear the faint rumble of the inspector's motor car fading down the lane. Soon, perhaps, there would be another confession, another tidy ending for the village to discuss. But Miss Marple knew that in human affairs, endings were never truly tidy, only quieter. She set aside her cup, folded the letters neatly, and slipped them into an envelope marked "To be kept." Then, with a faint, knowing sigh, she took up her knitting once more. The needles clicked softly in the still air as the village went on with its day, peaceful again, at least for now. But Miss Marple, with her steady hands and watchful eyes, knew better than to believe in peace. For in every quiet corner, behind every friendly smile, there was always the faintest taste of something bitter, something steeped too long in human weakness, like the poison once hidden in a teapot. That same evening, long after the inspector's motor car had vanished down the misted lane, Miss Marple remained seated by her fire, her knitting idle in her lap. The flames had dwindled to embers, casting a faint glow across the small sitting room. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows, a sigh rather than a storm. Yet within her thoughts there stirred a quiet unease, that subtle disquiet which comes not from doubt, but from completion, the sense that all had been resolved too neatly. She had lived long enough to know that when human affairs seem perfectly balanced, one need only look a little closer to find something still shifting underneath. and in Little Hawthorne, where manners and secrets shared the same polite smile, she doubted the peace would hold for long. Her eyes drifted to the envelope resting upon the table, the 2 letters sealed within, one from the Colonel, the other from Dr. Baines. 2 confessions, both self-serving in their own way, both steeped in guilt but devoid of true remorse. Confession, she thought, was too often a vanity of the conscience, a man's attempt to tidy his sins before someone else could do it for him. There was a soft rap at the door. Miss Marple started slightly, surprised. It was late, and visitors at such an hour were uncommon in the village. She rose, smoothing her cardigan, and opened the door to find Mrs. Finch standing there, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale in the lamplight. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound pitiable. "I do hope I'm not intruding. I couldn't sleep, not after all this dreadful business. They say Dr. Baines has been found, and now the inspector's been round asking questions again. I thought perhaps you might explain it all to me. You always seem to know the truth of things." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Do come in, Mrs. Finch. It's far too cold to be standing about in the night air." The woman stepped inside, her eyes darting nervously about the room as though expecting to find someone else there. Miss Marple poured tea with her usual calm precision and motioned her guest to sit. The kettle's whistle filled the silence for a moment before she spoke. "I hear you've been most helpful to the inspector these past few days," she said mildly. "Such a comfort to him, I'm sure, to have someone with such a fine memory for detail." Mrs. Finch smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "I only told him what I knew, Miss Marple. A body ought to do their duty after all." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "And it is curious, isn't it, how duty and opportunity so often walk together. You fetched medicine for the doctor the day of Mr. Ridley's death, I believe." Mrs. Finch stiffened slightly. "I did, yes. He was busy, and I happened to be passing the surgery. I've done such errands for him before. Of course. A kindness, no doubt. But I wonder, my dear, did you know precisely what was in the vial you collected?" The woman blinked. "Why, no. How should I?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Oh, I think you did. You see, you've always been rather observant, haven't you? You notice the smallest things, the labels on bottles, the handwriting on envelopes. And Dr. Baines, being as trusting as he was, would hardly imagine you'd tamper with anything he'd left upon his counter." The colour drained from Mrs. Finch's face. "You're mistaken, Miss Marple. I'd never—" "Never?" Miss Marple interrupted gently. "That's a very strong word, Mrs. Finch. I've known murderers who began their confessions with it. And in your case, I think never became a very long time indeed. Ever since your husband's ruin, perhaps. Ever since the Latham estate collapsed and you were forced to live among those who prospered from your loss." Mrs. Finch's hands trembled. "You don't understand. They took everything from me. My home, my security, everything. I only wanted them to feel what I felt." Miss Marple's voice softened. "And so you waited. You let time do its work until opportunity arrived in the shape of an inquisitive young journalist. You whispered to him, didn't you? Fed him pieces of the truth, just enough to make him dangerous. And when the web began to tighten, you added a final thread." Mrs. Finch's eyes filled with tears that glittered in the firelight. "It wasn't supposed to kill him," she whispered. "Just to make him ill, to make them afraid. I wanted them to see the rot underneath their respectability." Miss Marple sighed. "I do believe you. You only meant to harm as much as you had been harmed, but poison, like hatred, doesn't stop where one intends it to. It seeps further than we think." The woman buried her face in her hands, a sob catching in her throat. "When I saw what had happened, I wanted to confess, but then the Colonel took the blame, and Dr. Baines. Oh, I thought fate had done my work for me. But when he died too, I knew it was coming round to me at last." Miss Marple watched her quietly, her face unreadable. "And so you came here tonight, hoping to unburden yourself before the inspector finds proof?" Mrs. Finch's shoulders shook. I couldn't bear the silence any longer. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, and the clock chimed the quarter hour. Then Miss Marple rose and laid a gentle hand on the woman's arm. "My dear," she said, "it's never too late for truth, though it may come too late for forgiveness. The inspector will be here soon enough. I shall see to it that you're treated fairly. You've punished yourself already, I think, more than the law could manage." Mrs. Finch nodded weakly, her sobs subsiding to quiet weeping. When at last she left, guided to the door with Miss Marple's steadying hand, the night air swallowed her figure, and the street returned to its usual stillness. Miss Marple closed the door gently behind her and stood for a moment in the hush. She felt no satisfaction, only that familiar melancholy that always followed revelation, the weariness of knowing that evil, once unveiled, left behind not victory, but vacancy. She tidied the teacups, stoked the fire, and sat once more in her chair. Her eyes drifted again to the envelope upon the table. It seemed heavier now, as though it carried not only the words of the dead, but the weight of all that had been spoken in her little sitting room that night. The next morning, Inspector Graves returned, his expression grim but resigned. "You were right again," he said simply. "She confessed. She'll be remanded for questioning in the morning." Miss Marple only nodded, her gaze calm, her voice quiet. Poor woman. She waited so long for justice that she mistook vengeance for it. Graves sighed. "You make it sound almost forgivable." "Not forgivable, Inspector," she said softly. "Only understandable." When he had gone, the day unfolded with its usual ordinariness. The clatter of milk bottles, the chatter of sparrows, the faint hum of life returning to normal. Yet Miss Marple knew that normal was an illusion, one built on fragile courtesies and small deceptions. Little Hawthorne would settle again, as it always did, and the villagers would speak of this winter for years to come. But they would do so with lowered voices, as if afraid to disturb something sleeping beneath their own words. As for Miss Marple, she spent the afternoon tending her garden, pruning the last of the withered roses and scattering crumbs for the birds. It soothed her, this quiet labor, life continuing in small, careful gestures. But even as she worked, her mind wandered. She thought of the chain of events that had begun with a garden party and ended in confession, of how death, like gossip, moved quietly through the most respectable of settings, of how human hearts could conceal their poison behind the gentlest of smiles. When the sun dipped below the horizon, she stood at her gate, watching the light fade from the village. Peace, at last, seemed to have returned. Yet she knew better. Beneath the calm, life brewed as it always did, its kindnesses, its cruelties, its small hypocrisies, waiting, as ever, to reveal themselves in time. She turned back toward her cottage, the scent of evening roses following her. On the table inside, the teapot gleamed faintly in the firelight, its silver spout polished smooth, its reflection unbroken. Miss Marple paused a moment, then smiled faintly. "Strange," she murmured to herself, "how much truth one can find in a cup of tea." And with that, she drew the curtains, settled by the hearth, and let the world outside slip once more into its quiet disguise. The morning after Mrs. Finch's arrest, little Hawthorne awoke to a strange calm, as though the village itself were exhaling after weeks of holding its breath. The frost had lifted, the sky was clear, and the church bells rang with a solemn steadiness that seemed to mark both an ending and a beginning. Word of the final confession spread quietly, traveling from doorstep to shop counter, whispered rather than spoken outright, as if even now the villagers feared to disturb the fragile order restored to their world. Miss Marple, as usual, rose early. She moved about her cottage with the same gentle precision as always, though her thoughts were far away. The events of the past weeks, The death of Mr. Ridley, the confessions of Mrs. Hargreaves and Colonel Latham, and the final unmasking of Mrs. Finch had left her not triumphant, but reflective. The truth, she knew, had a curious way of punishing all who touched it. In this case, justice had been achieved, but it was not the sort of justice anyone would celebrate. It had left no heroes behind, only weary survivors. A knock came at the door just as she was setting the kettle upon the hob. It was Inspector Graves, his boots still damp from the dew, his expression softer than she'd seen it before. "I hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple," he said, "but I thought you might like to hear the final word on the Finch matter. She's made a full statement. Clear as daylight this time." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea and gestured to the armchair by the hearth. "And what does the daylight show us, Inspector?" He took a sip before answering, almost reverently, as if reluctant to disturb the quiet. She admitted to everything. She slipped into Baines's surgery the morning of the garden party, swapped a vial of harmless tincture for one she'd laced herself with digitalis, said she knew he'd use it in Mrs. Hargreaves's household, that he'd be too careless to notice. She wanted it to lead back to them all, to every name connected with her husband's disgrace. He shook his head slowly, but it went further than she planned, as these things always do. One dose too strong, and that poor fellow Ridley took it. She never forgave herself after that. Miss Marple listened, her eyes distant, the faintest crease in her brow. "No," she said softly. "People seldom do. Revenge has a dreadful habit of curdling into remorse once it's too late to be of any use." Graves nodded. "She'll face trial, of course, though I doubt she'll last it out. The doctor says her heart's failing. I suppose, in a way, that's mercy." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. The fire crackled gently, and outside, a sparrow sang upon the hedge. "Mercy," she repeated, almost to herself. "It's a word that sounds so gentle, and yet it often comes wrapped in tragedy." He looked up at her, studying her face. "You never seem surprised, Miss Marple, not even at the worst of it." She smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling with that familiar blend of sadness and wisdom. "One can't be surprised by human nature, Inspector. It's the same everywhere, whether in Little Hawthorne or London or St. Mary Mead. People are good and foolish and wicked and frightened all at once. They mean well sometimes. They do harm often, but always they reveal themselves in the end." Graves leaned back, a ghost of admiration in his expression. "And you, Miss Marple, seem always to be there to see it." "I?" She laughed lightly. "Oh no, I merely notice patterns. There's very little difference between a murderer and a gossip, you know. Both rely on small things being overlooked." He chuckled quietly. "You make it sound almost simple." "It is simple," she said gently, "but it isn't easy." When the inspector left, promising to send her word when the inquest concluded, Miss Marple stood for a long while at the window, watching the mist lift from the fields. Life was returning, as it always did, to its quiet rhythm, the postman whistling down the lane, the butcher's cart rattling over the cobblestones, Mrs. Pollard already sweeping her step as though nothing extraordinary had ever passed in their little village. Yet something had changed, something that could not be swept away. The garden party, once a symbol of cheerful civility, had become a story to be told in lowered tones for years to come. A reminder that evil, when it came, often wore its Sunday best. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk through the churchyard. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and laurel leaves. She paused before the new grave marked Owen Ridley, 1899–1951, a simple stone with no inscription beyond his name and dates. Someone, she suspected Vera Collins, had left a sprig of rosemary there, for remembrance. Miss Marple bent slightly, brushing a stray leaf from the stone. "He found what he was looking for. Poor man," she murmured, "but not in the way he expected." As she straightened, she caught sight of Vera herself walking along the far path, her head bowed beneath a modest hat. Their eyes met briefly, and Miss Marple gave a small, reassuring nod. The girl smiled faintly in return and continued on toward the gate. There was something steadier in her step now, a quiet resolve that spoke of healing beginning at last. When Miss Marple returned home, the afternoon sun slanted warmly through the windows. She set the kettle on once more and took up her knitting, the familiar click of the needles resuming its patient rhythm. The village clock struck 4, and the sound mingled with the comforting whisper of boiling water. Her thoughts drifted not to the past, but to the pattern forming beneath her fingers. There was order in it, symmetry, the kind of simple harmony she knew life rarely allowed. But it pleased her, all the same. Perhaps that was what she sought most, not the satisfaction of solving a mystery, but the restoration of balance, however fragile, in a world that so easily tilted toward cruelty. Outside, the faint murmur of everyday life continued, the bark of a dog, the creak of a cart wheel, the laughter of children playing somewhere beyond the hedge. Little Hawthorn, outwardly serene again, had returned to its customary calm. Yet beneath that calm, Miss Marple knew, the same human frailties endured, love and pride, envy and fear, waiting, as ever, for their next quiet awakening. She poured herself a cup of tea, perfectly brewed, and gazed into the golden surface for a moment. A smile touched her lips, wistful but content. "Human nature," she murmured softly, "is rather like tea. You never quite know its strength until it's been in hot water." The fire popped, the clock ticked on, and outside twilight deepened over the village roofs. The case of the poisoned teapot was over, but the lesson it left behind lingered, about the smallness of sin, the cost of secrets, and the clarity that only kindness and patience could bring. And in her quiet corner of the world, Miss Marple, ever observant, ever gentle, continued her eternal vigil, content to let life and all its mysteries unfold one careful cup at a time. ChatGPT can make mistakes. OpenAI doesn't use Amir's workspace data to train its models. ChatGPT says, the morning after Mrs. Finch's arrest, little Hawthorn awoke to a strange calm, as though the village itself were exhaling after weeks of holding its breath. The frost had lifted, the sky was clear, and the church bells rang with a solemn steadiness that seemed to mark both an ending and a beginning. Word of the final confession spread quietly, traveling from doorstep to shop counter, whispered rather than spoken outright, as if even now the villagers feared to disturb the fragile order restored to their world. Miss Marple, as usual, rose early. She moved about her cottage with the same gentle precision as always, though her thoughts were far away. The events of the past weeks, the death of Mr. Ridley, the confessions of Mrs. Hargreaves and Colonel Latham, and the final unmasking of Mrs. Finch, had left her not triumphant, but reflective. The truth, she knew, had a curious way of punishing all who touched it. In this case, justice had been achieved, but it was not the sort of justice anyone would celebrate. It had left no heroes behind, only weary survivors. A knock came at the door just as she was setting the kettle upon the hob. It was Inspector Graves, his boots still damp from the dew, his expression softer than she'd seen it before. "I hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple," he said, "but I thought you might like to hear the final word on the Finch matter. She's made a full statement, clear as daylight this time." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea and gestured to the armchair by the hearth. "And what does the daylight show us, Inspector?" He took a sip before answering, almost reverently, as if reluctant to disturb the quiet. She admitted to everything. She slipped into Baines's surgery the morning of the garden party, swapped a vial of harmless tincture for one she'd laced herself with digitalis. Said she knew he'd use it in Mrs. Hargreaves's household, that he'd be too careless to notice. She wanted it to lead back to them all, to every name connected with her husband's disgrace. He shook his head slowly. But it went further than she planned, as these things always do. One dose too strong, and that poor fellow Ridley took it. She never forgave herself after that. Miss Marple listened, her eyes distant, the faintest crease in her brow. "No," she said softly. "People seldom do. Revenge has a dreadful habit of curdling into remorse once it's too late to be of any use." Graves nodded. "She'll face trial, of course, though I doubt she'll last it out. The doctor says her heart's failing. I suppose, in a way, that's mercy." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. The fire crackled gently, and outside a sparrow sang upon the hedge. "Mercy," she repeated, almost to herself. "It's a word that sounds so gentle, and yet it often comes wrapped in tragedy." He looked up at her, studying her face. "You never seem surprised, Miss Marple, not even at the worst of it." She smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling with that familiar blend of sadness and wisdom. "One can't be surprised by human nature, Inspector. It's the same everywhere, whether in Little Hawthorne or London or St. Mary Mead. People are good and foolish and wicked and frightened all at once. They mean well sometimes. They do harm often, but always they reveal themselves in the end." Graves leaned back, a ghost of admiration in his expression. "And you, Miss Marple, seem always to be there to see it." "I?" She laughed lightly. "Oh, no. I merely notice patterns. There's very little difference between a murderer and a gossip, you know. Both rely on small things being overlooked." He chuckled quietly. "You make it sound almost simple." "It is simple," she said gently, "but it isn't easy." When the inspector left, promising to send her word when the inquest concluded, Miss Marple stood for a long while at the window, watching the mist lift from the fields. Life was returning, as it always did, to its quiet rhythm, the postman whistling down the lane, the butcher's cart rattling over the cobblestones, Mrs. Pollard already sweeping her step as though nothing extraordinary had ever passed in their little village. Yet something had changed, something that could not be swept away. The garden party, once a symbol of cheerful civility, had become a story to be told in lowered tones for years to come, a reminder that evil, when it came, often wore its Sunday best. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk through the churchyard. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and laurel leaves. She paused before the new grave marked Owen Ridley, 1899-1951. A simple stone with no inscription beyond his name and dates. Someone, she suspected Vera Collins, had left a sprig of rosemary there for remembrance. Miss Marple bent slightly, brushing a stray leaf from the stone. "He found what he was looking for, poor man," she murmured, "but not in the way he expected." As she straightened, she caught sight of Vera herself walking along the far path, her head bowed beneath a modest hat. Their eyes met briefly, and Miss Marple gave a small, reassuring nod. The girl smiled faintly in return and continued on toward the gate. There was something steadier in her step now, a quiet resolve that spoke of healing beginning at last. When Miss Marple returned home, the afternoon sun slanted warmly through the windows. She set the kettle on once more and took up her knitting, the familiar click of the needles resuming its patient rhythm. The village clock struck 4, and the sound mingled with the comforting whisper of boiling water. Her thoughts drifted not to the past, but to the pattern forming beneath her fingers. There was order in it, symmetry, the kind of simple harmony she knew life rarely allowed. But it pleased her all the same. Perhaps that was what she sought most. Not the satisfaction of solving a mystery, but the restoration of balance, however fragile, in a world that so easily tilted toward cruelty. Outside, the faint murmur of everyday life continued. The bark of a dog, the creak of a cart wheel, the laughter of children playing somewhere beyond the hedge. Little Hawthorne, outwardly serene again, had returned to its customary calm. Yet beneath that calm, Miss Marple knew the same human frailties endured. Love and pride, envy and fear, waiting, as ever, for their next quiet awakening. She poured herself a cup of tea, perfectly brewed, and gazed into the golden surface for a moment. A smile touched her lips, wistful but content. "Human nature," she murmured softly, "is rather like tea. You never quite know its strength until it's been in hot water." The fire popped, the clock ticked on, and outside, twilight deepened over the village roofs. The case of the poisoned teapot was over, but the lesson it left behind lingered about the smallness of sin, the cost of secrets, and the clarity that only kindness and patience could bring. And in her quiet corner of the world, Miss Marple, ever observant, ever gentle, continued her eternal vigil, content to let life and all its mysteries unfold one careful cup at a time, full 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 cup at a time.